So, Connor, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Therapy for Guys. I know it's been a while since I've been reaching out and trying to get you on the podcast, and it's just
Yeah.
really cool to finally make this happen.
Thanks, man. Yeah. Finally here.
So, for anybody who's listening who may not know who you are and what you're up to, would you mind just providing just a brief sketch of, yeah, who you are, what you do, and then from there we can kind of jump into a conversation?
Yeah. So let's see. What are the bullet points?
Where to start?
Yeah. I'm an author. My novel Hawk Mountain came out last year from Norton and Penguin and Norton in the US and Penguin in Ireland and the UK. I have a podcast called Against Everyone with Conner Habib, which is in about 200 some episodes now. And it features conversations with people basically about, I would say, mostly the spiritual dimensions of art, philosophy, politics, economics, and has had lots of different people on. Ian Mackay from Fugazi, Mona Eltawi, the Muslim anarchist feminist, some shared guests with your podcast, Peter Rollins and Todd McGowan. It goes all over the place, really. and
Yeah, no, it's great. It's one of my favorite podcasts.
Thanks. And yeah, I also give lectures and talks on the occult, particularly Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy. And I would also say, I used to be a sex work. Well, I still am, but I'm not that active anymore. A sex workers' rights activist. So yeah, that's the which came out of doing years of sex work. So, but that's it. It's just a long, long
Dude, that's
resume
like
with lots
yeah,
of
I was
different
gonna say
lives.
that's a very eclectic and impressive resume.
Yeah.
So I knew that whenever I reached out to you, I had just finished Hawk Mountain, and I've got to say I don't read like nonfiction, or excuse me, fiction that often. So
Mm.
picking up was kind of rare for me, but I had followed you for years, and I wanted to make sure that I read it, and I just thought it was fucking incredible. I mean, it was the best book I read in 2022. I know in some ways I'm a nobody compared to you, but so for whatever that's worth, it was a fucking great novel. And one of the things that really struck me about it, and this is why I really wanted to talk to you, was given what I do and kind of my specialty, I work with a lot of adolescent, like teenagers,
Mm.
and even a subspecialty of that is like transitional stages from like senior year into college, which
Yeah.
is kind of where Jack and Todd are at the beginning of the novel in some ways. I guess I wanted to give you a profound compliment that I didn't know how you were able to capture the male adolescent psyche so well. Like you did just a phenomenal job. And I sit spending, almost 40 hours a week engaging the, male adolescent psyche. And I don't know that I've accessed someone that's captured it so accurately and so beautifully and so powerfully. So way to go.
Oh, thanks, man.
How'd you
Yeah.
do it?
I guess there are a few ways. One is I just have a really good memory. So,
Mm.
I just remember being in it. I think I remember being the kind of kid I was, and sometimes wanting to be like a different kind of kid. And so I spent a lot of time imagining what it was like to be a different sort of kid growing up, a different kind of guy. And so I think I have a good memory from my imagination, not just things that have happened. And so I remembered some of that imagining as well. And I don't know. A, a lot of the book takes place, well, most of it takes place when they're adults. So it's also
Right.
just about people remembering a time. So in some ways, I was just kind of writing about myself in real time in a way. Because I was remembering a time when things happened in high school and trying to access that, and so were the characters. So some of
Sure.
that just kind of lined up.
Sure. I've got to say too, I want to be careful because I don't want to give any of the book away because I want any
Yeah.
listener, anyone who engages this podcast to go out. I would argue not just to read it, but I don't know if you feel okay with this. I think it was even better to listen to you read it through Audible.
Oh, thanks.
I
Yeah.
read it and then listened to it, and it was fucking great because I hate some of the books where they have some kind of boring white guy just read the text, but you read your own work, and that was so powerful. So anybody listening, go out and get the Audible book or just pick it up and read it because it's worth the read.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's like, it's just really good advice for people that are like, I'm not going to sit down and read a novel, or like yourself, people who are used to reading nonfiction, which, uh, like requires and also encourages a different kind of attention to a book than reading fiction.
Mm,
And so sometimes listening is the best way for people to access. So yeah, it's on Audible, and I read it, and was lucky to read it, because most authors don't get to read their own books
yeah.
when it's on audiobook. But because I have a podcast and my own audience, I think they were keen to have me be the person that did it. So yeah, definitely I would I would definitely suggest that for people as well. Yeah.
Okay. So, in addition to this comment that I was just amazed by how you captured the male teenage experience, I also was struck in the parts where, they're adults and they're having conversations and you get into different fantasies and fears and all the kind of good internal psychological stuff. I don't know if this is true, but I started reflecting on the fact that you must be someone who's done your own type of therapy or analysis.
Yeah.
That's a guess given just how well you're able to capture things. And obviously I never want to ask anyone to share things they don't feel comfortable with, but could that be something you get into is
Well,
exploring that a little
yeah,
bit?
you can't know if I'm comfortable with it until you ask.
Fair.
I'll let you know.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've been in and out of therapy with different, sort of modes of it since,
Mm,
I don't know, it's pretty young. So, I mean, my mom took me to a therapist, I think when I was like 13 or something like
mm.
that, for the first time, because I think she was engaging in therapy and she thought it was useful.
Got you.
Um, but
Were you open to it at 13 or was there a lot of
I just didn't know
resistance?
what it was.
Got
I
you.
didn't really know what it was. I only remember really one thing. I mean, I remember the therapist's name. He was great. And I only kind of remember one thing, which he asked me, and I don't know how this gels with your experience actually as a
Sure.
therapist working with people at that age, but he said something like, "What is it that you want? Like, what do you want? Tell me about what you want." And I was like, "Okay." And yeah, no, I must have been a little older, maybe. Yeah, I was like 15, and I said I want to fall in love, and he was like,
Mm.
no one your age ever gives that answer. And I
That's a
remember,
good answer though.
yeah, he was very impressed by the answer. And I remember, like, it was total projection at that point. I was, or transference almost. I was like, oh my god, my therapist loves me because I said love. I felt so proud of myself for giving the right answer. But that was not like serious therapy. Like the serious stuff came much later. I did 4 years of with two separate analysts of Lacanian analysis, and so that was pretty
I was gonna
intense,
say, man,
different.
that the little that
Yeah,
I like Lacanian theory. I don't know as much about the actual practice, but from what others have told me, it's pretty intense. Did
yeah.
you have any short sessions?
I only had one
Okay.
actually, and uh, it was, yeah. And so for people who don't know, there's like in Lacanian analysis, there's something called scansion. Like basically you can just end the session whenever you think it will be the most effective, and there are like rumors of Lacan, like shouting out the window when someone's on their way to therapy, your session is over, before they even got in the building. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly within the realms of possibility if you know anything about Jacques Lacan. Um, but anyway, so yeah, I had a session once, and I said something like, this is years ago, so I feel fine just saying it, but I said something like, if I was walking through the desert, and uh, I didn't know where I was, and I didn't know anything about myself, and I met somebody, um, I would have no idea what to say. And she just
Mm,
clapped her hands and she said, "Session's over." And I was like, "What?" And you can see I still remember what I was saying at the time.
yeah.
That might not have been it exactly, but the sentiment was basically the same. And I really mulled over it. I mulled over it again and again that day. So,
Hmm.
and since then, but yeah, those were profound experiences. I don't know that I'd necessarily do it again, but 4 years is meant to be a complete analysis. So I did 4 years with, actually 2 years is, I think, but I did 4 years with two separate analysts. So I don't know. I mean, it was good, and yeah, I'm not sure I'd do it again,
Sure.
but it was good.
So since you're kind of bringing up Lacan, I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about is just desire.
Mm,
And I was actually listening to an episode of in your podcast this morning. I was working out, and yeah, I think you were talking to Barry Taylor, and I forget the other guy, but I think you said, after
Unbelievable.
Freud, okay, yeah, after Freud, we become subjects not so much of knowledge, but of desire. And
Yeah.
I just wondered if that whole line of thinking influenced your book, because I don't know, I kept on thinking of Todd and Jack as these subjects of desire.
Yeah, so I don't that's actually taken from Todd McGowan's great book, Enjoying What We Don't Have. There's a line in there about it, where basically it was like Aristotle said we're subjects of knowledge, like you learn one thing and then you learn another thing and you discard the old thing, and that's how you sort of advance as a person. And Freud said, you know, obviously much later, Freud sort of looked around and said, no, we're actually subjects of desire. You want things and then you want other things, you're attracted and repulsed, um and you want things that you don't have, and you're driven to get rid of things that you think you want, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, I would go beyond that and say that it's that we're subjects of spiritual substances and states, but that's a completely different view that maybe we don't have to get into that. But I think,
No, but can we?
yeah, well, of course we can, but we don't have to take it there. But I mean, I think the book, I mean, Hawk Mountain is definitely more of a it looks at characters more from a psychoanalytic point of view than it does this other sort of
Yeah.
spiritual view, because I think most people develop up to a certain point, um their understanding of other human beings, like really, like far down the path is when you start understanding people through this psychoanalytic lens. I think it's a very deep and profound lens. I think there are things beyond it, but I do think it's pretty powerful way to look at the world and the way people interact with each other. And so that's, yeah, definitely what the characters are informed by. I'm not sure if you have done a little like intro where you talk about the book at all, or if I should say what happens in it
No,
to
I
some extent.
haven't. Please do that. I was
Yeah.
wondering about that, and I can't think of a better person to do
Yeah.
that.
We're a worse person.
There you
I
go.
mean, so the book is basically, there's two, it centers around two characters who went to high school with each other. So there's Todd, who's just a kind of, normal kid, basically living his life. And then a new kid comes to his school, Jack, in senior year, and Jack relentlessly bullies him throughout the year. I mean, really relentlessly, horribly
Mm.
bullies him. And most of the book takes place 15 years later. Todd is sitting on a beach, and his son Anthony is playing in the water, and Todd sees someone coming up the beach. And it's a novel, so whenever someone enters the scene, some shit is about to go down. And so it's 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 Jack, and they haven't seen each other since graduation, and Jack says, for very complicated reasons, can I stay with you for the night? And Todd, for complicated reasons, says yes. And then Jack stays, and he won't leave, and he starts to develop a very close relationship to Todd's son, Anthony. And then at a certain point, things take a turn and everything just goes wild from there. So it's, definitely there's a lot of psychological tension. A lot of it is about desire and drives,
Yes.
and wanting to pursue certain things, and almost letting desires consume you, as well.
Mm. Yeah. No, man, absolutely. So, and I wanna definitely stick close to Hawk Mountain, but one of the things I also wanted to kind of get your take on and explore was just selfishly, personally, I'm kind of trying to reimagine what a type of Christianity could look like for me, not in an orthodox kind of way, but maybe in the way that someone like Peter Rollins thinks about it, or even Todd McGowan. I'm not even sure he would identify in that way, but
Mm.
I know from accessing some of your stuff that you would be into kind of an esoteric or occult type of Christianity, and I'm intrigued by that. I just don't know much about that, and I'm just curious if we could kind of go there as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, and I mean, I know Peter's been on your show, I think a few times, right? And
Yeah,
Peter's great, and he and I are very close friends, but we also have deep um differences in how we we look at things and
yeah,
our take on the world. But it's never antagonistic. Like I think that's actually the wonderful thing about our friendship is
I
that
love that.
we spend a lot of time just sort of batting things back and forth, and we really respect each other's the spirit of each other's work. So
Sure,
I mean, I think, for me, uh, like if we're talking about what Christianity is, I think that there's this is a big question.
I know,
um
almost too big.
well, and it's not too big to talk about, but it's like it's hard to sort of come to the answers without having sort of a question that's a little more narrow. So maybe you could actually give a little bit more of a narrow question, and I'll see what I can do to answer
Sure,
it.
sure.
Because just saying what it is, I mean, I don't exactly know how to. I don't exactly know how to encompass that in an answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, one thing that this is maybe a way to get at both that question around Christianity, but also Hawk Mountain. I'm curious how you think about dreams,
Mm.
and to get even more specific, I know there's this image in your book around like white German shepherds, and I've heard you talk about kind of dreams around that image as well. And I can't get into all the details, but there's someone in my life who was quite traumatic for me, and they owned white German shepherds, so that was an interesting link. And so yeah, like go wherever you want to go with that in terms of the white German shepherds, your understanding of dreams, and how that might connect to kind of your spiritual vision or how you think about Christianity.
Ooh, okay. Yeah. So we'll start with the white German Shepherd. That's really easy. I used to have nightmares about white dogs for a long time when I was a kid. And when I got older, I took a Native North American religions class, and
Mm,
my professor was talking. I won't go into everything she said, but she was talking about how in certain cultures, white animals are trouble, but especially if you see like a white dog, it's like it's just evil, like it's an evil thing in this culture. And I had to get up and walk out of the class because I was so upset,
wow.
like struck by it. I mean, this is a long time ago, but it was like really affecting. And I talked with her about it afterwards, and she sort of told me some more of the stories of the people that she had whose reservation she lived on for a while. And so so that really stuck with me. And I've always had this thing about white dogs, if they're like pure white, not just German shepherds. I mean, not little dogs, like if it's just a little, white, I don't know, Pomeranian, not that you see, but but I love dogs. It was just this one thing. And so I don't really know what that's about. I don't
Mhm.
exactly know my connection to it. So that's a bit of a mystery. Only thing that I know is how deeply felt the presence of a white dog is. Like it's hard for me to be in the room with a white dog without feeling kind of nervous, or,
Mm,
even though I've grown a lot in this respect. Like I've gotten really far. Like I used to be really freaked out. And now I'm like, if there's one nearby, I'm kind of okay. Um, so I um so when we're thinking about dreams, it's important to understand that they're in some ways properties of a layer of our existence that relates to us in an intensely felt way, intensely
wow.
emotional way. They're not physical, really almost at all. So like when someone says to you, oh, I saw this in the dream, and then I saw this, and then I touched this and I heard this. Well, no, you didn't. You're eyes weren't open, your ears weren't doing anything, you weren't moving, your body, your physical body was lying flat, in one position, and that's that.
Right.
Like you weren't having sensory experiences. So what exactly is happening? And in occultism, the idea is that uh, our lives happen at the intersection of sort of different layers of being, and one of those layers is something called the astral realm, and that's where dreams happen. And the astral realm, and we're really going down this, but animals are sort of beings that are astral,
Mm,
that like they don't have an ego like human beings. The highest aspect of their being on earth, at least, is this sort of astral being. They are emotive beings.
mm,
Their behaviors are their emotions, whereas we can have emotional laden behaviors that we can think about. Their behaviors are emotions. So when a dog is like wagging its tail, that is happiness. That's not the dog showing you happiness. It is
mm.
total embodiment of happiness, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think there's some of the connection there for me, that there's something about my relationship to whatever's happening with that form in the astral realm. So you see, this is why it's hard to talk about these things, because
Sure.
like if it's for a new audience, like actually what needs to happen is a sort of an explanation of every step along the way has to
Yeah.
happen. So I have to talk about this sort of layering of bodies. I have to talk about what each of these planes are. I have to talk about why I would think they were real and not just some sort of bullshit wishy-washy way of talking about things. How people can experience it in their own lives, and so on and so forth. And then getting to these greater mysteries of how they might relate to Christianity and all that. I mean, that's just all very that's a pretty complicated thing. I think but I think we can just sort of start there.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that people ask me a lot about Hawk Mountain is why there's so many animals. There's so many scenes with animals in the
There's so
book,
many animals. Yeah.
and there's a lot of violence between animals. There's not violence enacted on animals in the book, but there's like animals eating other animals and this sort of stuff.
My
And
wife couldn't
yeah,
really listen to that because we were listening to it together in the car. She couldn't really listen to the scene where I think it's Jack when he crushes the mouse
oh yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah.
in the lab. Oh, that was rough.
Yeah. I mean, there's actually like one of the hardest parts for me is there's just a very short paragraph of like that's a crow eating a
Oh
baby bird.
yeah.
And that
Yes.
part was one of the hardest parts for me to write.
Mm,
But what happens is, maybe to understand this astral thing I'm talking about, like every animal evokes a different emotive response in every person. And some of those, yes, are uh you see similar responses in people to certain kinds of animals, or some animals we think are cute and some we think are ugly, and so on and so forth. However, like even those aren't completely static. And so we have strong emotive responses to most animals.
mm.
And if you ever doubt that, like think about the people or maybe you are one, who when a spider crawls across the table, you scream and run out of the room. Or
Yeah.
when a
I'm one of
dog is
those.
like, okay, or like when a dog is wagging its tail, like all you want to do is grab it and,
Yeah.
scratch it and just like play with it. Um, so I think that the animals in some ways then, and the animals also have different relationships with each other. So if
Mm,
you, like I said, there are animals eating each other in the book every once in a while. If you, for instance, see, let's say, if you see a crow, you might feel one way, and if you see a baby swan, you might feel another way. But like if, like in Ireland, you see a
mm,
crow capturing a baby swan, flying away with it, which is a really weird thing to see, but that happens here sometimes. You kind of get on team swan, right? But you
mm,
don't have anything against the crow, but you start feeling a certain way. However, like if you saw a dog eat a bee, you might not feel bad for the bee, right? Anyway, so all this is to say the animals represent a sort of vast outpictured landscape of emotion for the human being. The
mm,
animal kingdom is really a kind of externalized picture of the emotive landscape that exists within us. I'm not saying that that's all the animals are, so I'm not just reducing them to that, but I think we can sort of understand this kind of dream like presence of animals in our lives and how they evoke these really intense inner experiences in us all the time. And so that's part of what I'm getting at there, and then in the book as well. That's not really linking it to Christianity, but that would take like quite a bit longer
Sure,
to get to that point. Yeah.
sure. Well, now, what about this link? I think it was near the end of the book, and again, I'm trying not to give anything away. You quote, I think, Meister Eckhart, who
Yeah.
was right like a Christian mystic. Do you remember
Yeah.
the line?
Yeah. Only the hand that erases can write the true thing. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I was wondering if you could reflect on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think basically there's a lot of really interesting and detailed and particular clutter that's in the way of us,
Mm,
you getting in touch with who we really are. I don't think, like maybe some Buddhists would say, or psychoanalysts, that ultimately there's a kind of nothingness at the center. I don't really believe in the concept of lack. I think it's probably one of the worst concepts that psychoanalysis has come up with, and has unfortunately decided to make it central and primary to its investigations. But I do think that there's a that there is a way in which a lot of the world is kind of in the way of us getting to who we are. And so I think Meister Eckhart was really about erasing concepts. Wittgenstein was the same,
mm,
where he said, whatever, this is not the exact quote, but I always forget it. So it's something like, whatever we don't know, we must remain silent on,
mm,
and um or Byron Katie is like just a completely different example. Is like, if I ever had to say what I knew, I would never speak again.
mm,
So I think that all that's pointing to that we really clutter things up, not because complication or complexity is bad, but because I think that that's kind of anti-intellectual, but just because we don't uh, we don't generally create out of truth. We generally put one falsehood at the center and then just sort of spin things out from that. Was something that,
wow.
as much as I don't like a lot of his work, Terence McKenna said, he said, science, give us one miracle and we'll explain the rest.
Mm,
And I think you could say the same thing about this lack concept in psychoanalysis or some of the others. It's like, if you give us this one miracle, then we can do everything after that. But um, you can't ask us to explain the center here. And some people might say that the center is unexplainable, but I think uh, I think that's what Meister Eckhart is getting at, is basically, if we just remove and remove and remove the things that we've put in our way, then we'll be able to understand ourselves, and then we can go investigate the things we've removed again. So it's
mm,
not that you just banish it all and never go back to it.
yeah. Oh man. Can you go into if lack is a concept that doesn't resonate with you? I think right for someone like Peter Rollins and Tom McGowan that might be central.
Yeah,
How,
there's a conference organization called the LAC for psychoanalysts that I think
oh
Todd is
really?
deeply involved in. Yeah,
Okay.
so I think, like, I mean, it's pretty important. Um,
Help me, Connor, understand what your perspective would be.
yeah, I mean, there's another philosopher that people who are into Lacan usually hate, but I like them both. So, and this is Gilles Deleuze and his
Okay.
co-writer Felix Guattari, and they basically said that there is no such thing as nothing. There's only something,
Mm,
and that if and separateness is like an abundance. It's not something that's missing. So this is very hard for us to understand, because I think we're used to feeling separation. But if you
mm,
just understand that separation is also has its own being, it's not like an absence, but it actually has its own kind of fullness. Um, that goes a way to explain things. I know that that's not so easy to understand, but maybe you should just think of a nothingness or a lack or a space as just another category of
yeah.
being. That feels like nothing's there. Or one of the ways I would put it is like, um, but I'm getting this from some thinkers that I'm interested in, but I do experience this as true, which is that you know, the external world and the internal world are absolutely related. It's just that the external world is the part of our inner world that appears to be outside of us. So
Mm,
it's like imagine this thing that you call separateness is just presence wearing an invisibility cloak, or something
mm,
like that. There is something there. So I
yeah.
think that that's what people with, who are into lack, like they're not into that. And this is a Christian principle. God, we're really just whatever. The the idea that there's a void at the heart of everything. And I would say that, occultism and esoteric Christianity say there is a void at the heart of everything, and that void is Christ. And
Mm,
that nothing, what we call nothingness, is actually the presence of, this really powerful beingness of love at the center. So that's yeah, that's to answer that question or not. I don't know. I don't know. We'll see.
dude, and I mean this with utmost respect. I love your creative ramblings. They're amazing.
Thanks. Like I think it's funny because like when you watch philosophers like Deleuze or Lacan, or just there are all these other philosophers. They'll say similar things, or like
Yes.
they'll talk in a similar way that I'm talking, but they'll
Yes.
never be like, I don't fucking know. Like they'll never qualify at the end. And to me, that's always like a power move. Like,
Mm,
and I'm not interested in that at all.
I'm not either.
I realize good. I mean, I realize that like the potency comes in us trying to communicate with each other. So whenever I sense that I might be saying things that are actually opaque, the best
Mm,
way to recreate connection is to just kind of laugh at yourself and then be on the same plane at the other as the other person again.
yeah.
And that's not forced, that's real. It's like I can sense myself drifting when these things come out, not because I'm trying to sound smart or whatever, but rather I'm really just going into them and trying to stand in the integrity of them. But I know that maybe it might appear for a second that then the thread between you and I, or the listeners and I, or all of us, has
Sure.
been lost. But it's not lost. It's just you just have to hold on to it with your hand again, and then you're like, oh yeah, right. We're all sort of connected here. So yeah.
No, that's good. So, okay, one other question that connects some of this back to Hawk Mountain, and you've kind of already talked about it a little bit. I'm just curious how you think about like religion and violence and just nature and violence. I just thought that was a prominent, I don't know if it's a prominent theme in the book, but it just struck me that you were really wrestling with violence
Yeah.
and the ubiquity of violence.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I I'd have to like sit for a while to think about what I thought violence really was, because you can
Okay.
define it in so many ways. You can
Sure.
define it as, yeah, like an animal eating another animal is violent, or maybe a factory farm is violent, or maybe only people hurting other people is violent. I mean, some people define destroying property as violent, and some people say things like, I was verbally assaulted
Hmm.
today. They're insulted by someone, or I mean, so people locate what violence is in a lot of different places, and I'd have to really spend some time with that to figure out what I thought it was. um but it's undeniable that acts of force, have a particular effect on us when we encounter them. And the effect might the sort of emotional feeling might not be the same for everybody when they witness acts of violence, but there usually is some feeling there. There usually is a
Yeah.
particular kind of switch that's flipped if you're, there's a surprise, or if you're in violence all the time, there's a recognition of it as a certain kind of harsh form, harsh contour of life.
Mm.
So um it's interesting because I most of the things I write have either something violent or a threat of violence in them.
Okay.
I do have a book that's like probably 6 or 7 years down the line, which is just about love and that there is no violence in
Oh,
direct
wow.
violence. But that has to wait until I finish the next couple books.
Okay.
um,
Man,
so
I'm so
like I'm
glad to hear
already,
there's more coming.
oh yeah, yeah. So I'm already sort of thinking ahead to that one. But like, but the thing is like, the the quality of violence is like, mm, one of the things that it can do for us is rupture our
Mm,
idea of what is of how the world works. And in that way, when we encounter in fiction, especially like violence is very beneficial. It's like the shock to the normal that we need to be reminded that so much is possible.
mm,
In some ways, in life, violence usually represents an absolute lack of freedom. But
mm,
in a novel, violence can confer a sense of freedom, because we can see that the world is remakeable whenever we want to. And I think that if you look at, say, the whole thing around Salman Rushdie, writing satanic verses and people, and there being this sort of fatwa maybe declared against him, kind of, sort of, and the attacks that I say kind of sort of because it's not clear whether or not that's should have been really taken up or deeply in place by some of the people that say it should. But the attacks were obviously real on him afterwards. Um, People attack Salman Rushdie because um, novels are threatening to violence itself.
mm,
So if you have violence in a novel, what you're showing people, especially if it's a good novel, is that I don't need to turn the violent imagination into a dominating force. What I can do is contain it in art so people can encounter and reflect on it, which actually can help destroy violence. Now, it doesn't do that all the time.
wow.
There are, of course, novels that encourage violence, but most of the time art allows for the possibility to erode violence altogether, which is why people might react violently to a novel
Mm,
that seems to give people the tools to reflect on their own religion and their own lives. Whether or not that's a good novel, I mean, I don't think Salman Rushdie is a particularly good novelist, to be frank, but I do think that he definitely showed that there are different pathways of thought available, and those might have been upsetting or frightening to people.
yeah.
Yeah.
Man, those are some great thoughts. So is you're talking about violence, an act of force. Again, I don't want to give anything away in the novel, but what's coming up for me is the statue of Heracles and the lion.
Mm.
Why
Yeah.
why that symbol?
So there's a statue in the book, a little statuette on a nightstand in a house, and it just shows up multiple times in
Yeah.
Hawk Mountain, and it's Heracles wrestling the Nemean lion. I mean, I don't really know why that. There probably were a lot of other images that were available to me, but I think part of it was, I think about, if you think about the strength card in the tarot, or the force card if it's the
Yeah.
Marseille deck, a woman, a virgin, perhaps, or a maiden holding open the jaws of a lion. And
Mm,
you see in that card a sense of, it's almost equanimity. Like the
mm,
lion has decided not to consume her, and she's decided not to run away. And so there's this tremendous, that's why it's called strength. And whereas in the legend of Heracles wrestling the Nemean lion, um, he he kills the lion. This spoiler alert for those who haven't read the myth. He kills the lion, and he drapes its skin on top of himself. And so in his myth, he finds peace with the lion by gutting it and
mm,
adorning himself with it. So he was overcome by the lion lion-esque, or I wouldn't say lioness, but that means a female lion, but he's overcome by the lion's lionness. Like he's doing what the lion's doing.
Mm,
He's overcome by it, and he has to kill it, and then he's stuck with it. He's stuck with its presence afterwards. And I think that that's it. It's like
okay.
it looks like a labor of strength, but if you compare it to this other image, which never comes up in the book, but for me is I love that card, is actually something that's much more generative, which is sort of holding, not running, and not being consumed. You know.
Oh, I love that, man. Yeah,
Mm,
I've seen that you really enjoy the tarot, as do I.
mm,
Some
cool.
wonderful symbolism there. Yeah. I wanted to ask about Catcher in the Rye, right? Because it comes up several times in the book. I was just curious, kind of how that novel kind of impacted you, and in what way it shaped Hawk Mountain.
Yeah, and for people to see the cover of Hawk Mountain in the US, it's a take on the old Catcher in the Rye
Yeah.
cover. Um, and the Catcher in the Rye is quoted in it, as is a separate piece, and Lord of Flies comes up as well.
Mm,
And I mean, I think that the all those novels that we read in high school. I mean, I don't know if you had to read those in high
I
school.
did. I did.
Yeah, they're horror novels. I mean, they're really fucking crazy in a lot of ways. They have really dark contours, and um those really stuck with me. It's like you're in this really tumultuous emotional time, and you're reading these books about kids going through, extremity in one form or another. And I think they can have a real resonance with you. And so that was what was training, guiding, being a companion to my imagination when I was in high school. And so
Okay.
I was like, but what is it? What is it about these books? And they all have the same kind of feel. And
Mm,
it's not just because I read them in high school. They were curated in a way for us because they had this certain feel where there's this like threat of love and hatred all at once in all those books, and again sort of being consumed or fleeing, and
yeah.
different versions of that. And so I think that that really informed me. I mean, Catcher in the Rye famously, is said to have like driven people to madness. Apparently, I haven't seen it, but apparently there's a South Park episode where like people just read Catcher in the Rye and then just go shoot people.
Oh,
It's
that's
like
hilarious.
because they're two like famous assassins who like were inspired by Catcher in the Rye. And so I think um the I think I think I was just sort of thinking about that. What is it about these books that really get under people's skin and disrupt them? And also, why do we not see these books as so weird and
Mm,
horrifying and intense? And instead it's seen as normal. And what does it mean that these are kind of normalized books? I love them, and I think that they should be widely read, but I'm just
sure.
was curious about it.
Mm. Oh yeah, man. Okay, another thing that I wanted to ask you about your own kind of personal philosophy, but as it relates to Hawk Mountain, is just, you know, we talked about desire. What about sexual desire? It seems like homosexuality is something in the book that gets explored a little bit. Um, Maybe even unrequited love a little bit. So is anything come up around those themes for you? I'm sure there's a
Yeah.
lot you could say about it.
I mean, what is there not to say? I mean, yeah, I mean, I think sexual desire, yeah, I mean, the book is in a lot of ways it's just a book about repression. I mean,
Mm,
so it's not it it's not too hidden. I mean, the book, there's just a lot of sexual repression and longing and stuff in the book. And some of it's homosexual, some of it's not. I think because there's two men in the center of the book, like that's obviously where people's focus is going to go, but there are lots of other relationships in the book as well.
yeah,
And a lot of other versions of repression that appear in those relationships, between men and women, between, teachers and students, between just faculty at a school.
right.
So it's all over the place. And I think it's just everybody's sort of pulsing with desires that they can't enact and maybe wouldn't want to, or whatever, all the time.
Mm,
um I think for me, the point of the book is to say, you know it is not to give a picture of a certain kind of desire that's based on identity necessarily, but to give people the feeling of what it's like to have to repress and silence desires, and affection and love. Um, Obviously, when that kind of repression happens in society, it's worse for people for whom there are also laws and stigma and regulation and a history of violence and oppression against.
yeah.
So, queer people or gay men, lesbians, whatever. But I do think everybody deals with that in one way or another. Everybody deals with the repression and the silencing of their desires in one way or another. And it's not good for us, but we don't seem to be able to um, have access to solving this problem by any other means than just driving the silence deeper and
Mm,
encoding language, hyper encoding language and behavior. And that's also not good. That's also not good. So, like, one of the things is, in that bullying time between Todd and Jack, like, Jack and some of the other kids are calling Todd faggot, like,
right.
again, even though there's no indication that Todd is gay. Like, it's just what they're calling him. And when Todd is a teacher in later life and he hears kids calling each other that, um, basically, people are just like, yeah, but that doesn't mean anything anymore. People don't mean anything by it. And he's like, is that true or is that not true? Do
Mm,
people, and what would it mean if people said that we don't mean anything by this word anymore? Like, what kind of tension is being expressed between people to use this in, like, a silly or a funny way, um when it's, a word that has a lot of wounding and baggage behind it? And what kind of tension is being expressed? Why would you say it if you didn't mean it at all? Like, what would even be the point of saying it,
that's a great
if,
point.
if it's meaningless?
Yeah.
And should it be, I mean, I have my own thoughts as someone who's gay and dealt with being called that word as a kid, but,
Mm.
like, and as an adult, but what is it like? Should it be taken away from people just by virtue of its past meaning? I mean, that's a whole other thing. And it's very, it's there are just a lot of questions there, and a lot of, hard answers that come from, sometimes from certainty and sometimes from strong feelings and sometimes from just trying to do the best you can to manage the complexities of the situation. So I think, um a lot of, yeah, a lot of desire and the way it comes out and the way it's held back, I think anybody can understand their version of that. And I think anybody that says that they don't is either in a very, very, like, small minority of extremely fortunate people, or, you know, um, or kidding themselves. And even people who are sort of sexually open, or,
Mm.
say that they're unrepressed or whatever, a lot of times, you can show how repressed you are by constantly talking about how you're not, in the
Oh,
same
that's so true.
yeah, like, in the same way that people who spend all this time at the gym sculpting their body to have six-pack abs,
Mm.
take their shirt off, but then they're never, so they don't ever have to be naked. It's like they're never exposed if they look a certain way. So, I
Yeah,
mean, I
dude,
think,
well said.
there's, all that's packed in there for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, Connor, as we kind of look at sexuality, I know at one point on my journey, this was in my when I was doing my therapy, my therapist recommended that I read Wilhelm Reich
Yeah.
and just kind of get into that a little. He was a Jungian, and that's a little bit of my past too. Um, can I ask you what Reich means to you, if he's still an important figure to you, and how you kind of incorporate his thinking into your own project?
Yeah, it's funny because I've kind of struggled with him for, I don't know. I mean, it's probably like 25 years or something like that. I've been sort of
Wow.
mulling over Wilhelm Reich off and on,
Sure,
and
sure.
I wrote a little bit about him. I did a couple podcasts about him, one with this guy who wrote a book called Wilhelm Reich Biologist, James Strick, who also runs some of the Wilhelm Reich organizations in the US.
I think I
I'm
read that.
Oh, it's great. It's a great book
Yeah,
because he did all his work on, the Harvard archives of
right.
Reich's work, what's left of it after the FBI, was it the FTA, I think, destroyed. Um,
Yeah, those motherfuckers.
um, but I think here's this person who thought was a student of Freud's, but was like, Freud, you're not sexual
Mm.
enough. Like you're not talking about libido enough, which is it's a pretty intense proposition. And then was like, so what is this exactly? And then
Mm,
went into these political spaces, mostly working with Marxists and finding out that although the people were really excited about him because he was like teaching people how to do free sexual health clinics and
right.
teaching people about sexual pleasure, that the Marxist leaders couldn't bear or tolerate that. So he's kicked out of psychoanalytic circles for questioning Freud, and he's kicked out of Marxist circles for, wanting to create sexual health and promote sexual pleasure. And then he starts doing this really hardcore, what he would think of as scientific work, um, with orgone accumulators and cloud busters. If anyone's ever heard the song Cloud Busting by Kate Bush, that's about Wilhelm Reich. And you know and so he's trying to sort of say that libido, in some ways, that sexual energy, for lack of just shorthand, obviously, is sort of pulsing through everything, which
Is,
is
is, that,
what
is that the
Freud said.
orgone energy?
Yes,
Yeah,
which is what Freud said too, but Freud wouldn't have named it in this way. And
right.
right, like, you can even see it making new organisms, and you can see it in the sky,
Yeah.
and you can harness it, and you can collect or accumulate it, and you can use it to help people with health problems.
Mm.
And I think all that's really fascinating and important, and I think he had really powerful psychological insights. But it's not that he was, how do I say, it's like he couldn't create a strong connective thread through everything. Maybe
Mm.
I'm not sure if I agree with this or not, but let me just say it and see
Please.
how it
Yeah, that's
sounds
what I
to
tell
me.
my clients. Go ahead and say anything, and then we can just edit it. And
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's like he had a lot of profound observations that he thought he had created a coherent connection between, but actually there isn't a lot of coherence
mm,
there. So he understood that there was something um, atmospheric and
mm,
energetic going on. He understood that people tend to uh, sexualize and idolize their oppressive structures. He understood that there was a different sort of energetic property to different kinds of matter and different kinds of human conditions and illnesses. But when he tried to sort of thread them all together, he came up with this idea of orgone energy, and that proposition is false. It's kind of like
mm,
Rupert Sheldrake, who I think is a great critic, but this whole thing of morphogenic fields is just not true.
mm,
And the way he just tries to force everything into this totalizing theoretical mechanism.
mm.
I get maybe I'm thinking the same thing as the lack here, although I think
I,
the
I,
lack
I
is
I was I was wondering about that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I think the lack is a much more coherent and thoughtful. It's so coherent that it's actually hard to argue with, but
Mm,
then you can sort of drill down and dismiss it when you go far enough. But I think, like, it's this thing with it is this thing with Reich where the orgone energy thing, it's just poorly named and too aspiritual to really get into what is going on. But I do think he just has tons of great observations, and he's
Okay.
just a brilliant person. But and then I think that that's why people end up dismissing him, or someone like
Mm.
Rupert Sheldrake, who they have these great observations that that should be taken very seriously. But it's like, because they weren't able, or because maybe they were striving too hard to come up with this organizing principle, which just didn't make sense. And that's not to say that there is no orgone energy. It's just he tried to sort of stuff everything into that, and his own theories about it, I think, are a little weak, even though the results and the observations from what he saw are very strong, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So okay, what's coming up for me? Do you happen to know the religious studies scholar? He's actually here in Houston at Rice University, Jeffrey Kripal.
Yeah.
Okay, he writes a lot about the intersection of like spirituality and sexuality. I guess I want to know from you, do you think Reich and others could be a resource for this type of Christianity, maybe that you're talking about, that's open to exploring sexuality in ways that aren't so restrictive and oppressive and repressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think he has a book called The Murder of Christ, so there's that. But I think Wilhelm Reich does. But I mean, I think um yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty there. I think that is it a resource? That's hard to say, because once you touch stuff like that, once you touch powerful and influential thinkers, they can sort of lead you away from the core spiritual truths that you're using them as resources
Mhm.
for. So we just have to be careful with that kind of stuff.
Okay, maybe one last question, if you're open to that, if you have time. Um, Rudolf Steiner, I know he's someone that I've heard you talk about. I don't know hardly anything about him. Is there anything you could say about him that would maybe open some doors, would maybe pique some interest for people that are curious?
Yeah, I mean, and he's an important person to look at now, because more and more his name is sort of coming out. I mean, he's always been, since his life, very popular in certain European countries,
Mm,
and very well known. But in the US and elsewhere, he's not really that well known by name, although people might know his the fruits of what he's done, like biodynamic farming, Waldorf schools, community shared agriculture, and so on and so forth. And certainly some of the people whose work he, whose work was influenced by his, like, Rachel Carson um, and a bunch of other people. So I think, and in the psychological field, uh, Marjorie Spock, for example, and so if that's child psychology,
yeah.
but I think I think so. It's important because a lot of people are sort of reaching for him now in ways that are wholly inappropriate and
Mm,
completely wrong. Um, and I think so. It takes a lot of work to go through this person's efforts, which include like 6,000 lectures and
oh, wow.
like dozens of books, and all these initiatives. And it's very hard to sort of get yourself oriented properly, and also to understand the profound influence and permeation his work has had in culture already. So I just want to say that, like, yeah, like, I want people to look into it, but I want them to look into it with a sense of uh, humility, I guess, and
Mm,
also uh, real investigation, because he's on a lot of people's lips in ways that I think are quite irresponsible now.
mm,
So all that is to say, like, here's this person from the late 19th, early 20th century that has developed all these things that I've mentioned already. And his mission really was to get us through this necessary period of uh, humanity where we were materialists and relying on fully materialistic explanations of how things work. That the world is basically just matter and motion, and or or just concepts about matter and motion. I say that just to keep all the dialectical materialists, the Marxists and psychoanalysts and stuff uh, on not letting them off the hook here
Sure,
either.
sure.
Because they like to dodge and say they're not materialists or dialectical materialists, but it's all actually kind of the same thing ultimately when you have a more radical view that's rooted in spirituality. And to say, like, if we want to actually change things in the world, if we want to move forward, we have to do that from a real understanding. So again, it just goes back to some of the points that we've
Yes,
covered again and again.
sure.
And the best way to start, well, one way to start at least, is just to ask the question, what is the human being?
Mm,
And while attempting to answer that question, allowing answers about politics and culture and economics and conceptions of reality to unfurl from there. And there are lots of spiritual exercises he
mm,
offered to do this, lots of ways to engage with yourself and to engage with the world that could help you come to a real conception. He he said something like, I don't want you to believe me, but please, I do want you to try to understand me,
mm.
and I think that that's a really important part of this. Is a lot of people just take up the information, as if you can just read it and take it as information, but unless you actually have experienced some of the things that he's offering, then it ends up just being that, just being information, and then it becomes completely not useful. In the same way that, like, I'm sure tons of people are like, therapy, that doesn't work, or that's not for me, or whatever. But
Or
once you
I'll
start
just read a
going,
self-help book.
right, yeah, or I went to one therapist and it was terrible, so I'm never going
Right.
again. It's like
Yes.
when you go and you actually have the experience for real over
Mm,
time, then it
mm.
starts to work in you. And
Yes.
also, when you go to therapy and if you just have a therapist that just wants you to believe everything that he says, then that's not a good therapist. She says that's not a good therapist either.
Right.
And also, a lot of times when you think you've really gotten it in therapy, you actually, like, have just opened up,
Mm.
the passage that you really need to go down. So,
So well said. I agree. 100%.
so, so that's how to approach him in a sense. Also, is
Okay.
like, I can't just read it. I can't just think it's not worthwhile. I can't just think I've gotten it after engaging for a little bit. And I think, I wish maybe there is, but I wish there were a therapeutic term for this. The
Mm.
thing where people read something and then immediately they want to educate others on it. It's just like they take it in and they want to spit it out, like, right away. People do that all the time. Like, it could be with wellness stuff, it could be with some article they read, and
I see it on Twitter all the time.
yeah, exactly. Like, you
And
take
and
it in,
and I've
spit
probably
it out.
engaged in it too, if I'm honest. So you're
Well,
you're like
I
you're
used to for
challenging me.
sure. I used to for sure. And then I saw someone actually who's a friend, I used to be a close friend of mine who's a therapist, like, doing it all the time. And I was
Mm.
like, chill the fuck out, dude. You read that in a book yesterday. Like,
You know
like,
where I see this, and you probably aren't even interested in like stoicism, but
yeah, yeah.
I just work with a lot of young men who get obsessed with like the quotes on Twitter or whatever, and they
Yeah.
read a little bit, and then what happens is they completely shut down their emotions. They kind of completely misappropriate what I think it's supposed to be doing, and it
Mm.
creates havoc in their psyche. And so I guess that's just one instance of I think what you're talking about is not truly digesting it and letting it sit and having the experience, well, regardless of the philosophy.
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting quality of masculinity, I would say, is that men want to encounter an excuse to hold on to the deprivation that they have already felt.
Mm.
Like I don't know how else to explain it, but it's like when people encounter something that like tells them that porn or masturbation or something like that isn't good for them, like they'll immediately be like, whoa, yeah, I always knew, like, so they find this confirmation, but it particularly seems to be around things that are experiences, or things that deprive you from going deeper into an experience.
Isn't
So,
this why somebody like Jordan Peterson is so popular?
oh, totally, because he's completely shallow. I think it's like he's offering that. He's offering it, in the strength card, it would be the running away from the lion. Basically,
Yes.
he's offering running away that looks like staying with it, but it's
Oh
actually just
man.
always like avoid the experience, avoid it, and then you can call yourself an adult, or you can call yourself a man, or you can call yourself masculine, but actually like encountering the experience without also then the opposite is like going in and just trying to destroy it or smash it or kill it or whatever, which is just another form of avoidance. So I think,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, I think I was just thinking about it in terms of like, yeah, the Stoics, it's like, oh well, I don't need to feel or respond or react to anything,
Right.
like it's not events that upset us, it's our thoughts about events that upset us. Well, that is a profound observation, but that's not like that shouldn't lead you away from engaging in the event or the experience. And even
Absolutely.
no disrespect to people that do this, but even CBT, to some extent is like just switch from the experience. And I think that it's a
Dude,
good
totally.
intervention when it's needed. It's like a good antibiotic when you're like in deep suffering, but like,
Right.
yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, I lied to you because I said that was my last question. I do actually want to ask you one more
Okay,
if that's
let's do it.
okay.
Yeah, let's do
So
it. Yeah.
I do tend to ask because this is therapy for guys. I like to reflect on gender and even masculinity in the modern world. I mean, you've already reflected on something very powerfully around that. Is there anything else that you think about when you think about the idea of masculinity, wherever that goes in your psyche?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think about a lot, and it's funny because this came up in marketing stuff around my book, is
Oh,
this idea of toxic masculinity. Like
okay.
the people marketing were like wanted to market it as somehow having something to do with toxic masculinity. I was like, no, I really don't want that at all. And there are lots of reasons why, and a lot of it had to do with just sort of marketing on in zeitgeisty terms, which I didn't like. But
Mm,
one of the reasons was that, like, people don't know what masculinity is, so why are they talking about toxic masculinity as if they understand what that means? It's actually a nonsense term because people are hard pressed to define masculinity rather than just assign it qualities that are related to men. And so there's a really beautiful book called 13 Ways of Looking at a Man by Donald Moss. It's a
oh,
psychoanalysis book. I mean, it's heartbreaking and it's stunning. And
dude, I gotta check that out. Thank you for that recommendation. Okay.
yeah, it's so great. There's a part in there of this Sebastian Younger going to Afghanistan and talking to soldiers there, and they're all like, yeah, like there's this place where we all go. These American soldiers like, oh yeah, there's this like one night a week, like we all go and we like fuck these Afghani guys. And Sebastian Younger's like, what? And one of them says, and he's like, isn't that kind of like gay? And the guy's like, no, it'd be gay to not do it.
Mm,
And he has this like weird moment, of like encountering that. And Donald Moss is like, see, this is actually, we can talk about what masculinity is now, because what masculinity is always needing to be part of a group that you can never truly be a member of. And so like
oh
it's
God.
masculinity is a desire. It's not a thing, it's not a set of qualities, it's a form of desire. And
Mm,
if you're able to deal with that desire in a healthy way, then great, then there's nothing wrong with masculinity at all. And I don't even care about what contents it takes, or like what forms it takes, if you can deal with the desire in a healthy way. But to the point where you just try to banish its qualities, which are you know somehow assigned to men but not exclusively supposed to be about, et cetera, et cetera.
right.
I think that gets really confusing. and so anyway, I just think it's a really ill-defined concept, and there are people that are really looking into it. I've read lots of trans men and women who have really deeply gone into the subject. There's a book
Sure.
called Testo Junkie, which is a really fascinating book, and kind of mind fuck. I mean, I don't agree with everything. I don't agree with anything in most things I read, but like in that book in particular, there are things that strike me as a little weird. But I do love that book, and um, there's all and this book, 13 Ways of Looking at a Man, and I
Okay.
think that like we're just battering around this term all the time, toxic masculinity, without even having an idea what masculinity means, and so
I
it
think that's a
becomes
great
this
point.
useless term, you know?
Yeah. Man, I don't know if I haven't watched it, but it just makes me kind of sick. What was it? Matt Walsh did that documentary, What is a Woman? As though we could actually answer the question, what is a man? You know?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Like there's a baseline of which we understand. I mean, I think it's really like all of this, this idea of like, this is what it is to be a man, it's
Right.
like, but then I can comfortably say that that's horseshit, but then it becomes tricky because people can find themselves responding to that and being like, that's bullshit. But then when they try to sort of find a pathway out, um, they use these terms like toxic masculinity, or they use, terms that actually can end us driving us deeper in. And if you don't think that that's
Mm.
true, think of how many people respond so intensely against that kind of, speaking by being like, I just love, shooting shit and, and fucking, like,
Yeah.
and fuck you if you don't like that. You know what I mean? It's like,
Oh,
so
yeah.
I
Especially
think
down here in Texas. No.
totally. So like, there's got to be a different way to reach people that's not about that, but not just because you're trying to organize with or work with people who might just be assholes, or treat women like shit, or have transphobic or homophobic thoughts or whatever, but rather because like you want to offer real like healing to people,
Mm.
and you can't do that just by sort of coming up with some sort of weird name for something and expecting that to do the work for you.
Sure. Do you think too there's some shame for men around enjoying their sexuality? Like this is what I mean. I sometimes think, this is kind of crass, but see if you capture the nuance, that I want to love my dick but not be one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
That's complicated. I'm sure it can be taken in the wrong way, but I want to really enjoy, right, my penis, but I
yeah.
definitely don't want to engage in things that would make me a dick.
Well, I mean, I think it kind of goes to that Matt Walsh thing you're talking about.
Mm.
Is like there's no there's no real conception about what healthy sexuality is, so we keep trying to frame things in terms of this is bad and this is bad and this is bad, but like no, like what are we measuring that up against? I mean,
Right.
obviously like certain kinds of harms are obviously, where we're taking away people's freedom and autonomy, and or enacting violence on them. Those are not good.
Right.
But when we have we're trying to come to an idea of what's a healthy engagement with our own sexuality, like where's the model?
Mm.
Like who's actually going to model that for us? Like that's very hard to even conceive of, because our culture has been so sick about sex and sexuality for so long. And I think um there's shame for everybody at this, but the shame shows itself in different ways. I think,
Mm.
like trying to like trying to like have a conversation, an honest conversation between gay men and women, for example, about sex would be really difficult, because women have to go through a portal. Well, not all women, but like women sometimes have to go through a portal of learning how to of engaging with being able to say no on their own terms,
Right.
and then finding their way to yes. Gay men, it's like they have to be able to say yes to desire that is forbidden to them before they can understand the truth of their no, because like otherwise they just reject every sexual experience for the rest of their lives and never come out of the closet.
Mm.
So it's like there's so much um, discordance between people's abilities to engage with their sexuality and engage with sex that it almost makes conversation impossible. And those are groups of people, but it happens in individuals as well. And, like in every cultural narrative, it's like cultural narrative after cultural narrative, and every movie, TV show, whatever, is just like, oh, like this player cheated on his wife. Like this guy was like looking at porn and his wife didn't know. Like this, this person wanted to have an open relationship. This guy is like 7 years older than his girlfriend. Like
Mm,
all this like nonsense talk that is supposed to self-evidently give us the answers about right and wrong and sexuality. It's like, what is that measured up against?
that's a
Like,
great point.
when were things fucking healthy before? Even when people are like, yeah, like, oh, porn is ruining young men's sexuality. I'm like, the proliferation on the internet. I'm like, really? Was it good before porn was on the internet? Because
Mm,
please tell me where you think this rape culture that we live in came from. Did it just emerge only when porn showed up on the internet? Maybe actually this is the way out of it. Maybe
mm,
this is an educational opportunity for us where, instead of hiding sex, we have to encounter it. I mean, I'm not saying I know that, but it's like the thought, even the thought of that isn't allowed to enter into public
right,
conversation, which is
right.
preposterous. It's always presumed that um, sex that doesn't there's a center of gravity where sex that does not look like a religious model of
Mm,
shame and monogamy, and like there's always a gravity so to that, where anything that starts to deviate from that at all is usually brought back into the fold, and anything that starts to sort of wander away from that and change the cultural narrative gets really beaten down very quickly by lots of different people that think they're doing good things. So yeah, it's really hard. It's hard to it's hard to enjoy pleasure and enjoy sexuality because it's always being measured against a completely totalizing, oppressive bullshit historical
wow, wow.
narrative.
Connor, that's some of the best stuff I've ever heard about these issues. I need to wrestle with some of that's really good. Damn. Thank you
Yeah, no problem.
for getting me to think. Well, I guess before we sign off, is there anything else either about the book or any future projects or any events coming up that you wanted to just talk about? I'll include all your information in the show notes, of course.
Yeah. No, I mean, really, it's just, the book, the book is out, and buy it. And if you don't like it, don't write a review of it. And if you do like it, write like a glowing review of it. And the
Yes.
podcast, is Against Everyone with Conner Habib. I have Patreon, patreon.com/Conner Habib. And those are the ways I engage. I mean, uh, you know, yeah.
Is a positive review on Amazon? Is that what you're saying?
Oh
Because
yeah, I was
I'm
thinking of
realizing
like
I haven't written one yet, and I
Goodreads,
need to.
Audible, all
Okay.
that kind of stuff. I always, yeah. I mean, I think it's whatever. I mean, whatever people want to do. Like
It
if you feel
helps.
if you feel compelled to warn people to not read the book because you hated it that much, then do what you think is the Lord's work. But if you like it, please do write that review because it does help. And if
Okay.
you like it, that's a good thing to do for an author that you
Yeah.
like.
So that's
And
homework for me. I'm gonna write you a glowing review. Okay.
Goodreads is probably one of the best places to
One of
write
the best
the
places? Okay.
yeah.
So Connor, would you mind just ending? I ask all the guests just to end with the line, continue the conversation. It's kind of the spirit of the podcast, just by saying those words,
So by saying,
continue the conversation.
oh yeah, continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.